If you've ever wandered through a museum and found yourself more interested in the strange object in the corner than the centerpiece, you already understand the spirit of this series. Because this isn't a straight line story, it's a collection, a cabinet of ideas, artifacts, paradoxes, and patterns, each one a small window into something much larger. And like any good cabinet of curiosities, the value isn't just in the objects themselves, it's in how they connect. Over the course of this series, we're going to explore education, not as a system, not as a set of policies, and not even as a technology problem, but as something much more human, something older, something that keeps reinventing itself, even when its core purpose refuses to change. Season 1 is where we open the first drawer, not with answers, but with better questions. We're going to look at the foundations, the things that feel so familiar that we rarely stop to question them. What is education actually for? Why does it look the way it does today? And why do so many attempts to change it feel like they only scratch the surface? These aren't new questions. In fact, they're some of the oldest ones we have. Thinkers like John Dewey and Paulo Freire spent their lives wrestling with them, not just in theory, but in practice. They challenged the idea that education is simply about transferring knowledge, and instead pushed us to see it as something participatory, contextual, and deeply tied to how we understand the world. And yet, here we are, still asking the same questions. Across the 8 episodes in this season, we're going to move through a set of ideas that feel simple on the surface, but get more complex the closer you look. We'll start with the purpose of education and how that purpose has remained surprisingly stable, even as everything around it has changed. We'll explore the tension between standardization and personalization, why systems that aim to scale often lose the very thing that makes learning meaningful. We'll look at assessment, not just as a tool for measurement, but as something that actively shapes how and what we learn. We'll dig into the idea of knowledge itself, what counts as knowing something, and who gets to decide. And we'll start to uncover a recurring pattern that shows up again and again throughout the series. The deeper you go into education, the less it behaves like a system, and more it behaves like a living thing. Messy, adaptive, resistant to control. Now, here's the part that matters for the bigger story. Season 1 isn't just setting context. It's laying down a thread that runs through everything else that follows. Because in later seasons, we're going to introduce technology, artificial intelligence, new models of teaching and learning, particularly those that promise to fundamentally change the landscape. But if we don't understand the underlying structure first, the purpose, the constraints, the human elements, then all of those innovations start to look like solutions in search of a problem. And that's a pattern we'll come back to more than once. Each episode in this season follows a simple rhythm. We talk about an artifact, something concrete, a moment, a model, an idea you can hold on to. The paradox, where things stop making intuitive sense. The pattern, where we zoom out and start to see where it all connects. And finally, the signal, a small but important indication of where things might be heading next. The signal isn't a prediction. It's more like a flicker, something easy to miss unless you're paying attention. By the end of the season, you won't have a neat conclusion, but you will have a different lens. And that lens is what we'll carry forward to season 2, where those signals start to get louder and a little harder to ignore. So let's begin. We'll open this first drawer and take a look inside. At first glance, it might seem like we're just talking about classrooms, curriculum, and assessments. But look a little closer, and you'll start to see something else entirely. Every generation of educational reformers seem to make the same prediction. The lecture is about to disappear. For more than a century, people have argued that lectures are outdated, relics from a time when information was scarce and professors were the primary gatekeepers of knowledge. And the argument usually sounds pretty convincing. If students can read the material themselves, if videos can explain concepts visually, and if simulations can demonstrate ideas interactively, and now if artificial intelligence can answer questions instantly, then surely the lecture will finally become obsolete. And yet, if you walk into most universities today, you'll still see something very familiar. Students sitting in lecture halls, a professor at the front of the room, an idea being explained. Sometimes the room is physical, sometimes it's virtual. Sometimes the lecture is recorded and watched later, but the structure, a knowledgeable guide helping learners navigate a subject, is still very much alive. So here's the question. Why does the lecture keep surviving every wave of educational innovation? Welcome to the EdTech Curio Cabinet. Hello, I'm Christina, the Curio Steward. And this podcast is really just a collection of observations about teaching, learning, and technology. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to work closely with universities, educators, engineers, and technologists, all trying to solve the same challenge. How do we help people learn complex ideas more effectively? And along the way, I've noticed something curious. Education technology evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change much more slowly. Every few years, a new technology arrives with the promise that it will finally transform education. Sometimes those tools genuinely do improve parts of the learning experience. But the deeper structures of teaching, the ways people organize knowledge, the ways students practice, struggle, and develop expertise, tend to change much more gradually. And that observation is really where the idea of this podcast came from. Historically, scholars sometimes kept something called a cabinet of curiosities. These were collections of unusual objects, artifacts that were interesting, puzzling, or revealing in some way. A strange fossil, an unfamiliar instrument, or an object whose purpose wasn't immediately obvious. The goal wasn't simply to collect answers, it was to collect interesting questions, to observe patterns, to understand the world a little bit more deeply. This podcast takes a similar approach. Each episode, we examine a curio from the world of education technology, a tool, a practice, a trend. Something that reveals a deeper pattern about how teaching and learning actually work. And to explore these curiosities, we use 4 lenses. First, the artifact, the technology or practice we're looking at. Second, the pattern, where we've seen something like this before. And then the paradox, the unexpected insight that challenges our assumptions. And finally, the signal, a small clue about where learning might be headed next. Today's curio is one of the oldest artifacts in education, the lecture. The lecture is probably the most recognizable format in higher education. The professor explains ideas, introduces concepts, organizes knowledge, guides students through a subject. Sometimes it happens in a large auditorium, sometimes in a small classroom. Sometimes it's recorded and watched asynchronously. But the basic structure is remarkably consistent, an expert helping learners navigate a field of knowledge. And to many people today, that format feels a little old-fashioned. After all, we live in a world where information is everywhere. Students can search the internet instantly. They can watch tutorials online. They can access digital tools that provide immediate feedback. So it's reasonable to wonder, why do we still rely on lectures? If technology can deliver information more efficiently, shouldn't lectures have disappeared by now? And yet they haven't. In fact, lectures remain one of the most common forms of teaching across universities around the world, and not just in the humanities, but in engineering, in physics, in medicine, in economics, even in highly technological learning environments. So what's going on? To understand that, it helps us to look at the pattern. When you look at the history of education technology, you start to see a repeating cycle. New technologies arrive, people become excited about the possibilities, and then very quickly, someone predicts that the new tool will replace traditional teaching. In the early 20th century, motion pictures were expected to revolutionize education. Some commentators believe film would replace textbooks and lectures entirely. Students would simply watch demonstrations of scientific principles or historical events. A few decades later, radio and television inspired similar predictions. Why gather in a classroom, people asked, when lectures could be broadcast directly into your home? Then came computer-assisted instruction in the 60s and 70s. Then later, the internet. And online courses, and then MOOCs. And now, of course, artificial intelligence. Each wave of technology has brought real improvements, but none of them eliminated the lecture. Instead, something more subtle happened. The lecture adapted. Professors began using slides, then digital demonstrations, then recorded video. Today, lectures are often supplemented with online materials, interactive exercises, and discussion tools. Clayton Christensen and his co-authors in Disrupting Class discuss the decline of the traditional one-size-fits-all lecture model, predicting its replacement by student-centric learning. But the lecture itself still remains. And that suggests something interesting. Maybe the lecture isn't simply an outdated information delivery mechanism. Maybe it's doing something deeper. And that's where the paradox emerges. One of the most common criticisms of lectures is that they're passive. Students sit and listen while information flows from instructor to learner. And certainly, poorly delivered lectures can feel that way. But when you watch a truly excellent lecture, something very different is happening. A skilled instructor doesn't simply present facts. They organize knowledge. They explain how ideas connect. They highlight what matters and what doesn't. They point out common misconceptions, and they demonstrate how experts approach a problem. In other words, a good lecture is not about just delivering information. It's about showing how to think within a discipline. And that's a very different role. When students encounter a new subject, whether it's thermodynamics or linear algebra or organic chemistry, the challenge isn't just absorbing information. The challenge is understanding how the pieces fit together, what the intellectual landscape looks like, which ideas are foundational, which ideas are subtle, and which mistakes people tend to make. Experts build on that mental map over years of practice, and a good lecture helps students begin building that map much faster. It's a kind of guided intellectual journey. And that may be one of the reasons the lecture keeps surviving every technological wave. Not because universities resist innovation, but because lectures fill a role that other tools haven't fully replaced. So what does this mean for the future? The signal here isn't that lectures will disappear. Instead, their role may be evolving. In many modern classrooms, lectures are becoming shorter and more focused. Students might watch short lecture segments before class and then spend time solving problems, running simulations, discussing ideas with peers, or working through complex scenarios. In this model, lectures become something like conceptual scaffolding. They help introduce ideas and organize knowledge. But the deeper learning happens through practice, exploration, and feedback. Technology can support this shift in powerful ways. Digital platforms can provide instant feedback. Simulations can create interactive environments. AI tools can help students explore ideas more independently. But those tools often work best when they are a complement rather than the replacement for the instructor's role. So the future of learning may not involve abandoning lectures. Instead, it may involve repositioning them within a richer learning ecosystem. And that's one of the interesting lessons from this first curio. In education, new technologies rarely erase old practices. More often, they reshape them. They combine with them, or they push them into new roles. So the next time you hear someone say that lectures are about to disappear, it might be worth asking a different question, not whether the lectures will survive, but how they might evolve in a world where students have more tools and more opportunities to learn than ever before. Education evolves quickly, but the patterns of learning change very slowly. That's why we keep the cabinet open. Thanks for exploring the EdTech Curio Cabinet.